Welcome to Grattan Institute Speed Briefing. I'm Jordana Hunter, Program Director of Grattan's Education Program. I'm one of the authors of the new Grattan Institute report that we're discussing today, Ending the Lesson Lottery, How to Improve Curriculum Planning in Schools. I'm joined by one of my co-authors, Amy Haywood, and we'll be sharing some insights with you all about the report that we've published. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you today from the lands of the Bunurong people, and Amy is on Wurundjeri land. We acknowledge and celebrate First Nations people on whose traditional lands we're all meeting today and whose cultures are amongst the oldest in human history. I would like to pay my respects to their elders past and present and to Aboriginal elders who may be joining us here today. Now, to get us started, I want to just introduce you to the work that we published yesterday, Ending the Lesson Lottery. Grattan Institute has spent quite a bit of time now thinking about teacher workload challenges in schools. This is a really pressing issue, and it's certainly making teaching more challenging, and we think it's actually having a negative impact on student learning. So it's of utmost importance that we grapple with these issues effectively. Those of you who've read our January 2021 research and 2022 will have seen that we did a big survey last year that shows that teachers are really struggling to get to their core part of their job, including preparing for effective teaching. 86% of teachers in our 2021 survey indicated they don't have enough time for lesson planning, and 53% raised concerns about having to reinvent the wheel. Now, we know there are a lot of issues that are stretching teachers very thin in schools that policymakers need to grapple with, but lesson planning is a key challenge that we need to address if we're going to deliver the educational outcomes for students that we so desperately want to achieve in this country. So we've decided to do a deep dive in on this lesson planning issue in schools and look closely on how schools can be better supported to deliver high quality lessons day in, day out. That's what our report that we published yesterday focuses on. So just to be clear at the outset, this report is really focusing in on high quality curriculum planning in schools. There's some excellent work that's happening right around the country and a lot of teachers doing a great job of lesson planning already. And we wanted to use our report to shed light on that exemplary practice. We also wanted to recommend concrete practical steps governments could take to lighten the load on teachers, because while there are examples of exemplary practice, we know not all teachers and all schools are able to do the high quality planning that they think is important for their students. What our report is not about, and I want to be really clear about this at the outset, it's not about reforming the Australian curriculum or the New South Wales syllabus or the Victorian curriculum or any of the other state variants around the country. We are not calling for changes to those Australian curriculum and other documentation. What we're looking at is curriculum implementation in schools. And we are not interested or talking about mandating any particular curriculum materials for teachers to use or that schools must use. It's about creating more choice and more options for teachers to have access to high quality curriculum materials that they can adapt and choose to use if they want to. Now, in typical Grattan policy research style, we cast the net quite far and wide in terms of research for this report. We did a fairly extensive literature review. We also did a brand new survey that we conducted this year where we surveyed 2,243 teachers and school leaders on that particularly pressing issue of curriculum planning in schools. So that supplements the research findings from our survey of over 5,000 teachers and school leaders conducted in 2021. We ran a number of interviews and focus groups throughout the year. We costed out some of the time and dollar amounts associated with curriculum planning at that school level and at the system level. And probably my favourite part of the research was conducting 5 on-site case studies of really exemplary high-performing schools around the country to understand what it took for those schools to adopt a whole school approach to curriculum planning. We were very excited, being Melburnians, to escape the confines of Melbourne and actually visit some schools around the country. One of those was a wonderful school, Marsden Road Public School in southwestern Sydney, a primary school. We went to Perth and visited Serpentine Primary School and Averley Secondary College. And closer to home, we visited Docklands Primary School and Ballarat Clarendon College, an independent school in regional Victoria. Now, these schools provide a good mix, I think, across government and independent sector, primary and secondary, advantaged and more disadvantaged contexts, and schools that were newly established as well as schools that had been around for a while and went through that process of adapting their approach to adopt a whole school approach to curriculum planning. So it's a good spread of case study schools and experiences there. Now, I'm going to throw to my colleague, Amy Haywood. She's going to talk through some of the findings of the report. This will be a quick taste of what's in the report, and we hope you can all take some time to have a look at the full report on our website.
Thanks, Jordana. Before I get into some of the nitty-gritty of the survey results, I just wanted to talk a bit about what curriculum planning actually is, because we think that governments have really underestimated the complexity and time required for that task that we're expecting of students. So we know that from looking at the mandated curriculum that it's quite broad. It gives, broad direction for teachers, but it takes a lot to go from that mandated curriculum through to bringing it to life in the classroom. So you can see that example that I put up there. I probably put it up there because I'm a trained English and history teacher. It's from history. If you've chosen to teach ancient Egypt in Year 7 history, you'll need to teach students about the organisation and roles of key groups in ancient society, such as nobility, bureaucracy, women, and slaves. There are a few other elaborations in the curriculum, but it leaves a lot of room for teachers and the huge number of decisions that they need to make about exactly what they're going to do across all of those lessons, how they'll assess it, and also what students need to learn. That can be quite challenging for beginning teachers, for teachers who might teach out of field, or also for teachers who may be history trained, but they're not experts in ancient Egypt, which could be a lot of us. And we estimate that takes a teacher working on their own, if they're starting from scratch, about 500 hours to develop a year's worth of curriculum materials for one subject. That's a really near impossible task if you think about secondary teachers typically have 4 different subjects. So that's 2,000 hours a year, or all of their working hours. They'd never step foot in a classroom. But even more worrying, they actually don't, if even a really hardworking teacher working on their own isn't able to then sequence what they're doing and make sure it links up to what's happened in the year before and what's coming next. That's why we're recommending, and our case study schools have really shown us that a whole school approach is best. And that whole school approach is really a collective agreement on the specifics of what we're going to teach and how we're going to teach it in our classes. It means that schools are sequencing their learning across years of schooling. So we know that what a student learns in prep flows through right through to grade 6, or in high school 7 to year 12. And it also means that teachers are able to use those shared curriculum materials across their classes. We think that is a huge benefit because it reduces that teacher's individual planning workload. If they don't have to create everything from scratch for their classes. It creates consistency for students, and that's particularly important for disadvantaged students as well. Now, that's a very quick overview on curriculum planning, but we're going to look at what's happening in schools. Unfortunately, we saw that whole school approach is not the norm in our schools in Australia. So when we ask teachers, just about materials, do you have access to a comprehensive bank of curriculum materials for all of your classes? Only 15% of teachers said yes. And worryingly, this was half. For teachers in disadvantaged settings, only half of them in comparison with advantaged settings said that they did have access to these materials. So there is that equity gap. When we asked teachers, who's doing the planning, almost half of them said, they're planning mostly on their own and mostly responsible for their class. That takes a huge amount of time. We asked teachers, in a typical week, how much time are you spending just creating and sourcing materials, which is only a small part of what it takes to be prepared for class. And a typical teacher is spending 6 hours a week, but a quarter of teachers are spending 10 hours or more, which is a huge amount of time. And when we asked teachers, were they satisfied? Over half said that they're not satisfied with their school's curriculum planning approach. What this means is it leads teachers, unfortunately, it leaves them in a really difficult position. And a lot of them go to the internet. We ask them what sites they most commonly or frequently every fortnight visited. And on average, a teacher went to 5 different sites in a fortnight. And the most popular ones were those social media ones like YouTube, Teachers Pay Teachers, Twinkle, over state or territory department websites and the like. What we were able to do and take a look at was, okay, well, where these shared materials are in place and where teachers say they have access to a shared bank, does it make a difference to how they're approaching their work? And actually, we saw it made a really stark difference. So you can see we've just brought out a couple of key stats. There's a lot more in the report, but teachers said that they were much more likely to have a common understanding of what effective teaching looks like and that collective agreement across their teaching team. They were they said students were much more likely to consistently learn the same thing, regardless of what classroom they're in. They actually were 3 times more likely to say that they had a regular process for reviewing and improving instructional materials rather than starting from scratch. And a big one that I think is huge in my perspective is they were almost 4 times more likely to say that they were satisfied with their school's current approach to planning. Now, the other big benefit that we saw, because we were able to see how much time teachers were telling us they were spending on just sourcing and creating instructional materials, was did it make a difference if they had access to that bank? And we could see that teachers saved 3 hours a week when they did have access to that bank, so which is a huge workload saving for teachers, and that benefit is real. We extrapolated that out and looked at what would that estimate out to across the Australian teaching population, which is 20 million hours a year. So that is a very quick run through of what we found in our survey. There's a lot more in the report. I'll give it to Jordana to talk about the recommendations.
Thanks so much, Amy. I'm impressed with how quickly you managed to move through those headline findings there. What I wanted to do now is just spend a few minutes talking about the recommendations. As we said at the outset, one of the key things we learned when we did our work inside the case study schools, and we spoke to schools and teachers that had managed to adopt a whole school approach to curriculum planning, was that getting this up and running in schools is a significant amount of work. It requires a significant commitment from teachers to come together and form that really strong collaborative and collective understanding of what great teaching and learning looks like in their school, and that collective agreement about how they'll support students to move through their learning journey over time, which allows them to build those common shared materials, delivering some of those benefits that we saw in the survey data and we saw in those case study schools. There's no doubt about it. The heavy lifting of whole school curriculum planning has to be done at that individual school level, so that teachers have true ownership of the materials that they're using in their classroom and are able to make the most of those precious instructional minutes that they have with students. So there's no getting around that teachers, as the experts in teaching and learning, need to have ownership of that approach. The question for us is, what can we do to help those teachers and schools that are struggling to get there? Because as our survey data suggests, if only 15% of teachers have access to these materials in schools, there's currently a number of barriers that they're facing to establishing this approach. So coming back to that question of what can governments do, government departments around the country, at the Commonwealth and at the state and territory level, and also those Catholic and independent sector leaders, what can they do to lighten the load for teachers and make it easier for schools to adopt those whole school approaches? That's where our recommendations sit in this report. At the outset, what we want to see is much stronger investment in high quality, comprehensive curriculum materials that schools can pick up and use if they choose to do so, if they're finding it hard to develop that approach themselves in-house. Now, what does that look like? I wanted to provide an example that we profile in the report. It's from Arc Curriculum Plus. It's a not-for-profit organisation in the UK, and they've developed a suite of resources for mathematics and literacy that go right through from the early years of primary school up to upper secondary. And you can see an example here on your screen now. It's essential that these materials are high quality, comprehensive, and well sequenced right across the learning levels. What we probably don't need more of in Australia is more activities or lesson fragments, the type that a teacher might find if they Google Macbeth, for example, in a website search engine. What you can see in high quality comprehensive materials is that there's a clear sequence of learning over time, and it goes right down to that lesson level, providing those materials that teachers could pick up and use in the classroom. They could adapt it to their context if they wanted, but they could also pick them up and run with it, which we think is really important for those beginning teachers, those out of field teachers, those casual relief teachers, and those teachers for whom they have so many other things on their plate that on Monday morning they need something they can be confident that they can use in the classroom. It's also important that the materials are evidence-based, that they have embedded assessments, they're easy to use and have been road tested in real classrooms, and that they're quality assured. And we do have some recommendations in our report about how that quality assurance process might work effectively. For those who might be joining us perhaps from an economics background or a treasury background, I think a really important point to note is that this is a cost-effective approach. At the moment, we're asking teachers to spend hundreds and hundreds of hours, thousands of hours, and many of them are unfortunately reinventing the wheel. If government was to step up and to invest in the provision of high-quality resources that schools could choose to use, it would be a very cost-effective strategy. And, what we're currently asking schools to do is the equivalent of hundreds of times more expensive, for teachers over 200 times more expensive at least, we think. Before I move on from materials, just quickly, I think what we should think about as well is that governments don't need to start from scratch either. So there are a number of offerings in the not-for-profit sector, in the commercial sector, internationally, that we could draw on to use as a basis for developing high-quality materials that can be adapted to the Australian context. So our report goes into a lot more detail on those elements. Before I throw to Amy for a few questions and answers from the floor, I wanted to just touch briefly on the other pieces that we think are really critical to have in place. I think most important is this piece around professional development. When we speak to teachers who've been kicking around in education for a lot longer than Amy and I have been involved in the field, we hear that there previously was a lot more investment in professional development around curriculum expertise. We think it is imperative that we step up the level of investment in curriculum design and planning and taking a whole school approach. And this needs to be provided for principals and curriculum leaders as well as teachers. We are calling for all teachers to spend at least 50% of their ongoing professional development hours each year on curriculum-related professional development, which would recognise the criticality, I guess, of whole school curriculum approaches to supporting student learning. Now, school reviews are also a part of the puzzle here. Currently, most schools have an improvement-focused review, but we do hear that curriculum is often treated as a bit of a tick and flick item on a long list of issues that are looked at. We are calling for a significant step up in the focus on curriculum in school review processes. You'll find more detail on that in our report, but that is something that we think is really important for governments to send that message that curriculum matters and to give the leadership in schools the authority to focus time on those really important curriculum planning conversations at the school level. Now, before we wrap up, Amy, I think we might have time just for one or two very quick questions. So I'm going to ask one now that came in from one of our attendees. How can teachers and schools make sure that standardised materials work for all students who might have different learning needs?
Thanks, Geordie. I will try and be as succinct as I can, but there's a lot of detail in the report, and our case studies really talk about how this works. So please go and read them. But I think the fundamental approach here that we saw in the case study schools was that this whole school approach was foundational to actually helping teachers better differentiate and tailor what they were doing in the classroom for the needs of their students. So if I just think about one example, at Grattan College and in their maths department, they have this approach where they've agreed, okay, they have a specific set of slides that they'll use, and they'll have a specific set of slides that they'll use for a specific lesson in maths. So it might be a year 7 maths class. They all have the same set of slides. It might be 30, but they have like 5 that they've decided are essential slides. Everyone is going to teach those slides. But a teacher will then use a lot of their own professional judgment to use those materials in the way that best supports their learners. So that'll mean, they'll go through it at a different pace. A class might go through a lot more whole class instruction to make sure everyone's mastering the content before they move to independent practice. Another class might do it a lot slower, a lot quicker, and then they go to more of the extension activities. But it also means in terms of that preparation that a teacher's doing, because the materials are there, they know what they're going to cover, they actually have more time to sit with them and intellectually prepare for, who do I think is going to struggle with this content? Who will actually excel and need a little bit more, need a little bit more extension? So they're able to really tailor and adapt what they're doing in class to the needs of their students. The other thing I should say, that's about whole class instruction, but a lot of our case studies also had a really strong response to intervention model where they were using not just the teachers in the classroom, but also those support staff and other supporting teachers to target those small group or one-on-one kind of intensive tutoring opportunities to just boost students where they had those critical gaps and needed to further reinforce any kind of learning and skills before they could get back on track for class.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that, Amy. Unfortunately, that is all we have time for questions. We only managed to get through one, but we would love it if you could have a look at the report. Let us know what you think. Hopefully, we'll have some more opportunities for events, including hopefully with some of our case study school leaders, so they could talk more about what it took for them to get this up and running in their schools. Before we close out, I just would like to let everyone know the report is freely available on our website if you would like to read more. If you would like to see more research like this, please consider donating to the Grattan Institute so we can continue to do practical and rigorous research in education. In the spirit of this speed briefing, I will wrap up here and let you get back to your day. Thank you so much for joining us. Bye.